Jess called on a Sunday evening. She had no idea what she was about to tell me. She said, "I just wanted to thank you for helping us with the deposit." I was standing in my kitchen. I felt something shift in my chest. Dramatically quietly, the specific quiet of a word that doesn't fit. I said, "Of course. I didn't know about any deposit." My brother had called me 3 days earlier at 2 in the morning saying he'd been arrested for a DUI. I had wired him $3,200 at 3:47 a.m. I had gone back to sleep. There was no DUI, there was no arrest. There was a third-floor apartment in Denver with a move-in date of the previous weekend. That was version 1 and version 2. There were 4 total. They didn't match each other in 11 specific places. Before I walk you through all of them, I need to tell you about a Reddit post because there's a deleted post at the center of this story, not mine, Marcus's, posted on her personal finance about 6 months before the $3,200 call, under a throwaway account, deleted 19 days later. The post asked, if you borrowed money from a family member using a false reason and they found out, do you tell them the full truth about what you actually used it for, or just acknowledge the deception and offer to repay? He was asking the internet how to manage the fallout. 6 months before the call that created the fallout. I'll read it in full when you're ready. First, you need to understand who Marcus is, and who I was before that Sunday evening call. I'm 32. I'm a structural engineer. I have a flat in Birmingham, a stable job, and a savings account I have been building for 4 years with the specific intensity of someone who grew up watching money be the thing that caused most problems. Marcus is 28. He's my younger brother. He's been a reason to worry since approximately 2013. Not in a dramatic way. In the specific low-frequency way of someone who has good intentions and poor execution and an absolute talent for being in situations that require someone else's help. I've lent him money before this. Not large amounts. £200 here. £400 there. Twice I lent him more, once for a car he needed for a job that didn't last long enough to cover the repayment, once for a deposit on a flat that he then decided not to take. Both times he paid me back. Slowly. Incompletely in one case, but enough that I never had a reason to stop. That's the context. That's the soil this grew in. The pattern of Marcus needing things and me having them, and the understanding between us that I was always available for an emergency. His girlfriend Jess had been around for about a year and a half. She seemed good for him. Organized, warm, the kind of woman who arrives at things early and leaves when she said she would. I'd met her 4 times at family things. My impression was positive. My impression, as it turned out, was based on an incomplete picture. The Reddit post went up about 6 months before the 2 a.m. call. Personal finance. Throwaway account. Deleted 19 days later. I found it through a process I'm not going to detail here except to say that it exists, I have it, and it says what it says. I'm reading it in his voice. Word for word. If they find out what I actually used it for, is it better to come clean fully or to acknowledge the deception and focus on repayment without going into specifics? I want to handle this well. I'm not a bad person. I'm just in a difficult position. I want to handle this well. I'm not a bad person. Both of those sentences are about how Marcus sees himself. Neither of them is about the person he was planning to take the money from. He posted that. He sat down and wrote it and posted it. And then 6 months later, he made the call. The post got 12 responses. Most of them said, don't do it. 3 said, if you're going to do it, have a repayment plan ready before you ask. Nobody said it was fine. He deleted it 19 days after posting. Then he called me at 2 in the morning. Thursday, the 7th, 2:04 a.m. according to my phone. I was asleep. Deep asleep, the kind you only get on a Thursday when you've worked 11 hours and made dinner and been in bed before 10. The phone rang. I picked it up on the 3rd ring because when your phone rings at 2 in the morning and the contact name is your brother, you pick it up on the 3rd ring. His voice. Quiet in the wrong way. The specific quiet that comes after crying or shock, the kind where you're breathing carefully because you don't trust what happens if you stop. He said, I need you. I'm in trouble. He told me he'd been stopped on the A45. Do I? He was at the police station. He needed £3,200 for the bail or he'd be there until Monday. He'd already called Jess, but she was in Manchester visiting her sister and couldn't get back in time. He couldn't call Mum because she'd panic. I was the only one who could do it. Line second 11 from the call narrative start, he said, I know it's a lot, but I'll explain everything when I'm out. I just need you to do this right now. I want to tell you exactly what I did next, because I've thought about it a lot since. I sat up in bed. I turned on the bedside lamp. I opened my banking app. I checked my balance. I had £11,400 in that account. I thought £3,200 is the right amount for this. Not too much, not nothing. Bail amount. Then I typed his sort code and account number from memory. I had it from previous transfers and I sent £3,200. The transfer confirmation said it cleared. I put the phone down and went back to sleep. It was 3:47 a.m. The whole thing had taken 23 minutes. I did not ask what pub he'd come from. I did not ask how over the limit he was. I did not ask why he'd driven. I did not ask about a lawyer. I sent the money and I went back to sleep because that is what I do when Marcus needs something at 2 in the morning. That is the pattern I had always been part of. 3 days. Nothing. No text saying, I'm out. No call saying thank you. No voicemail. No message at all. I checked my phone on Friday morning, on Friday evening, on Saturday morning. I told myself it was shock. I told myself he was probably processing. I told myself I'd hear from him when he was ready. On Sunday evening at 6:14 p.m. my phone rang. Jess. I had not spoken to Jess since a family dinner in October. She'd never called me directly before. I felt something shift, not quite right, not quite wrong, before I even answered. She said, Hi, I'm sorry to call out of nowhere. She sounded warm, genuinely warm. The kind of warm that has no performance in it. She said, I just wanted to ring and say thank you for helping us with the deposit. Marcus said you came through and we're so grateful. I went completely still. The word deposit was doing something wrong in my chest before my brain had fully processed it. I said, Of course. I said it at normal volume. Nothing in my voice moved. I'm good at that. I said, How's the new place? She told me, Denver. They'd found it 2 months ago. 3rd floor of a converted building near Capitol Hill. Move-in had been the previous weekend. She loved it. Marcus had been brilliant getting everything sorted. I said, That sounds great. Tell Marcus I said hi. Good to catch up. I ended the call. Then I sat at my kitchen table, not doing anything, just sitting. My phone face down in front of me, the ceiling above me, the specific quiet of a room where something has just changed. No bail, no DUI, no arrest. The police station on the A45 at 2 a.m. Deposit on a 3rd floor apartment in Denver, Colorado that Marcus had funded with my money while telling me he was sitting in a custody cell. I sat there for approximately 7 minutes. I'm not guessing. I checked the call end time and the next thing I did was at 6:28 p.m. 7 minutes of sitting at a kitchen table. In that 7 minutes I made several decisions. I'm going to describe each of them carefully because the decisions are the part of this story that is about me as much as it's about Marcus. Decision 1. I was not going to say anything to Jess. Not yet. Jess had thanked me in good faith. She didn't know she told me anything significant. Whatever I did with this information, it wasn't going to start with correcting someone who hadn't done anything wrong. Decision 2. I was going to call Marcus. Not that evening, the next morning. I wasn't going to ring him angry and I wasn't going to give him the chance to build a story overnight if I gave him advance warning that I knew. Decision 3. I was going to build a file before I said a single word. Not because I planned this. Because I'm an engineer and that is how I process things. When something has gone wrong, I gather the information first and draw the conclusion second. I called Marcus on Monday morning at 9. He picked up in 2 rings. His voice was normal. Easy. Relaxed in the specific way of someone who has done something and made peace with it. I said, Was there ever a bail situation, Marcus? 3 seconds of silence. Then, I was going to explain. I said, I'd like you to explain now. Here is what Marcus explained. There was no DUI. There was no arrest. He and Jess had found the Denver apartment and needed the deposit plus first month's rent, $3,200 exactly. He knew I wouldn't give him the money for a move if he asked directly. He knew I'd say it wasn't an emergency, that he should wait, that he had savings of his own. So he framed it as one. He said, I knew you'd say yes if it was urgent enough. I said, you're going to pay me back £200 a month. I said, I'll send you the account details. I said, we won't speak about this again until it's paid. He said, yeah, okay. Fair. He said it like I'd offered him something reasonable. Which I had. Which is the thing about Marcus, he takes the reasonable option when it's available because he's not actually trying to cause damage. He's just very focused on his own situation and very optimistic about other people's capacity to absorb it. He paid for 7 months, and $1,400 total. In August, the payment stopped. No message explaining. No, I'm a bit short this month. Nothing. The direct debit I'd set up just stopped going through. I texted. He said, sorry, things are tight, I'll sort it. I said, okay. And I waited. Here's what the floor actually looked like for me. Not the financial floor, the other one. I had been the person Marcus called at 2 a.m. for all of his adult life. Not just for money, for anything. When he needed advice, he called. When a relationship ended, he called. When he didn't know what to do about a job or a landlord or a confusing official letter, he called me. I had been the structural thing in his life, the way I am trained to understand structural things, the part that holds the weight when the weight arrives. And the thing I had to sit with, and this took longer than I'd like to admit, was that he had looked at all of that and decided to use it. He had looked at the pattern, calculated what I would and wouldn't do, and built his lie around the answer. He had used my reliability as a tool. That's not the same as being a bad person. Thought about this carefully. It's something more specific than bad. It's a particular kind of calculation that only works if there's genuine trust to exploit. And the exploitation doesn't negate the trust. It just lives inside it. Which is honestly the worst version. 2 weeks after the payment stopped, Jess rang again. A Wednesday afternoon. Same warm voice. She said, I've been meaning to ring. I just wanted to check we were okay after everything. I said, of course. What's on your mind? She said, Marcus told me the real reason he needed the money. She said it carefully, like she'd been thinking about how to say it. I said, what did he tell you? And she told me a version of the $3 story I had never heard. According to Marcus, the version he'd given Jess the money wasn't for their deposit and it wasn't for a DUI. It was for a friend of his called Dom. Dom had been in an actual accident. Dom had needed the bail. Marcus had stepped in using my money because Dom couldn't reach his own family and the situation was urgent. Marcus had told Jess that I'd offered to help out of generosity and that Dom was paying me back directly. I let her finish. I said, I see. I said, thank you for telling me. I ended the call. 3 versions. All of them involving the same amount. None of them involving Dom, who as far as I knew didn't exist. Or the DUI. Or the deposit, except that the deposit was definitely real because Jess had mentioned it on the first call before she knew I didn't already know. I opened a spreadsheet. I am an engineer. I do not do things in my head when I can do them in a structured document. I labeled 3 columns. Version 1, bail due told to me. Version 2, apartment deposit told to Jess initially. Version 3, Dom's bail told to Jess subsequently. Then I made a row for every specific claim in each version. Location, reason, timeline, who else was involved, what the money was for, when it was needed. Whether there was a repayment plan. 11 contradictions, not inconsistencies, contradictions. Places where version 1 says Tuesday and version 3 says Thursday. Where version 1 says I was the only one he could ask and version 3 says I offered voluntarily. Where version 2 says Jess knew about the deposit from the beginning and version 3 implies she didn't know about the deposit at all. Then I thought about what I didn't yet know. 3 versions of a story all told to different people. I hadn't spoken to my mom about any of it. My mom who speaks to Marcus every Sunday. My mom who Marcus had definitely called for advice at some point in this timeline because that is what Marcus does. I rang her that evening. I asked casually, as if it had just come up, whether Marcus had mentioned anything about money recently. She said, oh, the loan thing? Yes, he mentioned it a few weeks ago. He said you'd given him an interest-free loan to help him get back on his feet, he said. It was a really generous thing you'd done, and he was lucky to have you. Version 4, an interest-free loan given out of generosity. No emergency, no bail, no deposit, no Dom. Just a good brother helping a younger brother get back on his feet. voluntarily, out of love. My mom said it was sweet. You've always been good to him. I said, yeah. I said, I'll talk to you soon, Mom. I ended the call. I had 4 versions of a $3,200 story. 4 different people had been told 4 different things. The versions didn't match in 11 places. Marcus had a deleted Reddit post asking how to manage the aftermath of exactly this kind of situation. And 1,800 of the money, the £3,200 minus the £1,014 he'd paid back over 7 months, was still outstanding with no payment plan in sight. I called Marcus on a Thursday afternoon, not at 2 a.m. At 3:15 p.m. when he'd normally be finishing the workday, normal hours, normal register, completely deliberate. He picked up easily. He said, "Hey," relaxed as ever. I said, "I'm going to read you some things." I said, "I'd like you to listen." I read him version 1, the DUI version. What he told me on the phone at 2 a.m. The station, the custody. I'll explain everything when I'm out. He was quiet. I read him version 2, the deposit version. What Jess had told me on the first call. Denver, 3rd floor. Move in last weekend. Still quiet. I read him version 3, the dog version, but his friend with the accident. The bail Marcus paid with my money on my behalf. The story he told Jess to explain why Jess's initial story didn't match mine. I heard him breathe. Nothing else. I read him version 4, the interest-free loan, the generous brother. The thing he told our mother so she'd think well of both of us simultaneously. Then I said, there are 11 specific points where these 4 versions contradict each other. I have them on a spreadsheet. I said, I'm not going to read you all 11. I think 4 versions is enough for the both of us. He said, I didn't want you to think badly of me. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, you built 4 different stories because you were trying to control what 4 different people thought. You didn't think about what it would feel like to be any of those people when the stories stopped matching. I think that's more relevant than what you wanted me to think. He said, I know. He said it quietly. Not performing. I said, the remaining £1,810 I'd like a plan by the end of the month. I said, not as a condition of anything. Just so there's a plan. He sent me a repayment schedule the following Sunday. $150 a month for 12 months. He's been consistent since. 8 months. Not a late payment. Here is the honest version of what I cost myself too. Because I think these stories are always partly about the person telling them, and I'd rather tell this part clearly than leave it out. Reading the 4 versions aloud to Marcus, I had prepared that. I'd thought about doing it for about a week before I called him. I knew what effect it would have. I knew that hearing all 4 versions in sequence would be worse than any one confrontation. I built the spreadsheet before I called because the spreadsheet was the mechanism of the call, not just the record keeping of it. Was that necessary? Or was some of it satisfaction? Thought about this. Honestly, and the honest answer is probably both. Probably the spreadsheet was necessary, and probably I also wanted to be the kind of person who shows up to that conversation prepared, because being unprepared is how you end up shouting or crying, and neither of those outcomes serve me. But I chose the moment, the method, and the register. Marcus didn't choose any of those things. And there's something in that in the preparation versus the chaos that wasn't just practical. I should say that clearly. The emotional release character in this story is Jess. Which sounds strange given that 2 of her phone calls were the thing that unraveled everything. But the 3rd call, she rang about a month after the 4 versions conversation. She knew by then what Marcus had done. He told her the truth. The actual truth. All of it. She said, I'm so sorry you were caught in the middle of his mess. You didn't deserve that. I said, you didn't either. I meant it. She hadn't known. She'd thanked me in good faith for a deposit that was funded with money I thought was bail. She was as much a recipient of the deception as I was, just from a different angle. She said, he's getting better. She said it the way people say it when they've decided to believe it, not naively carefully. Like she'd waited and chosen it. I said, I hope. So, I mean that too. The deleted Reddit post, the one where he asked how to handle the aftermath of borrowing money under a false reason. 12 people told him, don't do it. 3 people said, if you do, have a repayment plan ready. He deleted it 19 days later. Made the call 6 months after that. I keep the screenshot of the post. Same format as always, printed, sleeve, drawer. Not as evidence. Not as leverage. As a document. Because the post tells me something that the 4 phone calls don't. The post tells me Marcus knew 6 months in advance that what he was planning was wrong enough to ask the internet about first. He wasn't operating in the absence of conscience. He was operating with conscience fully present and overriding it. Which is its own specific thing. The thing where you know and you do it anyway, you do it anyway. The post also says, I'm not a bad person. I'm just in a difficult position. He posted that on behalf of a future version of himself. He was preparing his own defense before the act. And 12 people read it and said, still no. And he went ahead. I don't know what to do with the I'm not a bad person part. I genuinely don't. I think it's possible to be a person who is not bad and still do something that is specifically bad. I think Marcus is somewhere in that space. I also think that space is not as exonerating as the person in it tends to believe. Where we are. He's paid £2,000 of the $3,200. We're 4 months from the end of the repayment schedule. He hasn't missed a payment since the Thursday phone call. We speak on Sundays. Same as always. We talk about small things. The 4 versions don't come up. They don't need to. We both know they're there. Jess and Marcus are still in Denver. She seems happy. The apartment has apparently a very good kitchen. I have my savings account. Less than it was by $1,200. More than it'll ever be again in the way it was before, meaning I don't have the version of Marcus I had before, the one that felt straightforward. I have the accurate version, which is more useful. Less comfortable, but more useful. The thing I keep coming back to is the Reddit post. Not what it says, what the act of writing it says. He didn't write it to confess. He wrote it to find out whether what he was planning could be managed after the fact. He was doing logistics. Risk assessment. He was mapping the aftermath before the event. And when 12 people said the aftermath was unmanageable, he adjusted his plan not by not doing it, but by building 4 different stories to distribute the risk across 4 different people. That's not malice. That's a very particular kind of optimism. The kind that believes the people around you will absorb whatever you ask them to absorb as long as you present the ask correctly. It's worth thinking about who in your life holds that belief about you. Not as a warning, just as a useful thing to know. If any part of this story felt familiar, drop it in the comments. I was going to explain conversation. The moment you realized the stories didn't match. The version that got told to your mom. I read them all. New story every day. Subscribe, bell, you know the format. Stories like this one specific, documented, the kind that are still resolving when we record them. Son, I'm just in a difficult position. He posted that on behalf of a future version of himself. He was preparing his own defense before the act. And 12 people read it and said, still no. And he went ahead. I don't know what to do with the I'm not a bad person part. I genuinely don't. I think it's possible to be a person who is not bad and still do something that is specifically bad. I think Marcus is somewhere in that space. I also think that space is not as exonerating as the person in it tends to believe. Where we are. He's paid £2,000 of the $3,000. We're 4 months from the end of the repayment schedule. He hasn't missed a payment since the Thursday phone call. We speak on Sundays. Same as always. We talk about small things. The 4 versions don't come up. They don't need to. We both know they're there. Jess and Marcus are still in Denver. She seems happy. The apartment has apparently a very good kitchen. I have my savings account. Less than it was by 1,200. More than it'll ever be again in the way it was before, meaning I don't have the version of Marcus I had before, the one that felt straightforward. I have the accurate version, which is more useful, comfortable, but more useful. The thing I keep coming back to is the Reddit post. Not what it says, what the act of writing it says. He didn't write it to confess. He wrote it to find out whether what he was planning could be managed after the fact. He was doing logistics, risk assessment. He was mapping the aftermath before the event. And when 12 people said the aftermath was unmanageable, he adjusted his plan not by not doing it, but by building 4 different stories to distribute the risk across 4 different people. That's not malice. That's a very particular kind of optimism. The kind that believes the people around you will absorb whatever you ask them to absorb as long as you present the ask correctly. It's worth thinking about who in your life holds that belief about you. Not as a warning, just as a useful thing to know. If any part of this story felt familiar, drop it in the comments. I was going to explain conversation. The moment you realize the stories didn't match the version that got told to your mom, I read them all. New story every day. Subscribe, bell, you know the format. Stories like this one specific, documented, the kind that are still resolving when we record them. See you tomorrow.